Great. Thanks everyone for coming. Can everybody across the hall hear and see me? This is trippy. Like they're going to be like a solid minute behind. All right. Thanks Amanda and everybody who helped set this up. My name is Dan Kim. I work at a company called Basecamp here in Chicago. And I am thrilled to be here in my hometown talking about something that has meant a lot to me, that's had a major impact on my career and my life, and that of course is Kotlin. I want to talk about something I have boringly labeled a Kotlin Journey. It's fairly unoriginal. You might be asking yourself, what is that? It's basically about remembering what our lives have been like with Kotlin in it, right? Thinking back to sort of the moment that you first heard of Kotlin and kind of tracing it all the way up to this point in time where today. And just kind of thinking back on the entire experience and remembering like how excited you were at the beginning, thinking about all the amazing things we built and accomplished with it, how we learned it, what we struggled with, and really just thinking about that whole experience. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about my Kotlin journey because it's obviously what I know best and it's not theoretical. And there's a couple reasons I wanted to share that story in particular, not just because I like talking about myself. I always think it's kind of worth reflecting about stuff, like taking a moment and just thinking back about all the things that we have. It really helps to sort of give you perspective on where you're at. And I think in particular, it makes you thankful for what you have. And so as it relates to Kotlin, I think we can really appreciate how far we've come. I mean, it's only been like 3 or 4 years that most of us have been using Kotlin, unless you were like a really, really early adopter. And it's really interesting to think how much we've accomplished with the language, and I think that's worth celebrating and it's worth remembering. The second reason I wanted to kind of just talk about the journey is to just start conversations, right? Not just with me, but with everyone in the room and everyone in that room, and the broader Kotlin community as well, right? Sharing stories is sort of one of the best ways that we can learn from each other and sort of relate to each other's experiences, right? No two people in this room have had the same journey of how they've learned Kotlin and what they've done with it or anything like that. And so sharing these experiences is a really nice way of learning and relating to each other. And we can talk very openly about, you know, what was the same in our experiences, what was different in our experiences, what do we agree upon, what don't we agree upon. There's a lot of surface area we can cover. And ultimately, I think it helps us find this common ground where we can sort of relate to each other and then as a result, help each other learn and teach each other. So, as I was putting this talk together, I was kind of thinking about what my story with Kotlin has been over the last 3.5 years or so. And I realized, like, yeah, I did learn a lot and I built a lot of cool stuff. But between day one and today, there's been this huge change and this constant variation of skill level, sort of the emotions I went through, the circumstances under which those happened, and the experiences that I've gained in going through that, right? And so there were definitely times in that 3.5 years where I knew a lot of stuff, and there were definitely times where I knew absolutely nothing, right? Times where I was like super confident in what I was building, and other times where I was just making shit up as I went, right? There was, all of those things were happening in that 3.5 years. And it's been super wild if you think about it that it's only been 3 years. Now, having gone through that, it seemed like there were these sort of semi-distinct stages or phases of learning and experience that I went through. And so, as I often do, because I'm a dad, I started thinking about like, okay, there's these stages of like how I learned, like how does that relate to my life and my family, and specifically I was like thinking about my kids. And I realized something kind of weird, and it's a bit of a stretch, but you just got to stick with me on this one, is that the way that you learn Kotlin and sort of the stages that you go through with Kotlin, it's not all that different from these sort of life stages you go through as well, right? In life, you go through these stages where you kind of know some stuff, but you don't really know. And then as you get older, you advance and you learn more and more. You still make a bunch of mistakes as you go along through life. And all through that time, as you're learning more, your perspective shifts a little bit, your circumstances change a little, all sorts of things are happening, right, while you're learning. But ultimately, those experiences make you better, right? You make better future decisions based on it. And so I thought this was kind of an interesting parallel for this talk. And that's what we're going to explore, right? We're going to think about Kotlin as it relates to life. And specifically, I'm going to go through these sort of 4 life stages of a Kotlin journey. And I'm going to talk about the 4 that I went through and what I experienced. And I'm going to talk sort of about what they look like as I went through them. And by doing that, I hope it gives you sort of a general vibe of what you can expect in each stage. And in each of those, I'm also going to kind of talk about some tips and some things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through them. Especially if you haven't gone through them yet, I think they'll be helpful. But even if you have, it's sort of fun and good to remember, like, hey, remember when you knew nothing, and now you look back on that and laugh. So it's kind of fun to compare and contrast and think about sort of the entire journey. All right. So stage 1 is when you're a toddler. I skipped over being a baby because when you're a baby, like, you're just trying to stay alive. You're eating, pooping for the most part. So when you're a toddler, right, you are literally just learning to walk and get your feet under you, right? You're getting introduced to a bunch of new things. You're kind of figuring out, like, what do you like, what don't you like, and you're starting to develop some opinions. You know, as it relates to an actual toddler, it's sort of the time where they sort of figure out, like, do they like this? Do they not like that? Do they like certain foods? Do they like certain activities? And as it relates to Kotlin, you might still be trying to figure out whether or not it's for you, right? I know there's a lot of you here that probably use Kotlin, but maybe a few of you are still like on the fence about it, right? And there's some natural hesitation. I assume the people who have not really gotten into Kotlin much, but are using Java now, have not had a ton of exposure to it. And I totally get that, because back in 2015, I was exactly the same way. In 2015, we weren't using Kotlin then, I read this paper by Jake Wharton, who's an Android developer, and he wrote this thing about how they were potentially going to use it at Square and how it could have this huge impact in Android development. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, this is really interesting, and that's cool, but it's just a language. Like, things are going really smoothly, we were developing a new product. Like, I didn't see any real reason to make a big change and just, like, make a big splash from a technical perspective. I was just like, Java's fine. I was kind of thinking, like, maybe we're just rocking the boat for the sake of it. Like, why are we making this huge jump sort of just to do it? And so you might have something similar going on at work, or maybe you did in the past. And it's super natural to be risk averse and on the fence about it. However, my job today is going to be to get you to jump off the fence and come over to the Kotlin side if you're not already. And if you have, it's kind of fun to remember why we did it. And so I want to talk about a few reasons why I think Kotlin can make a huge, huge difference for you if you're not already 100% into it, from my experience, and think about why I think you'll really enjoy it. So the first reason that I think you should seriously consider using Kotlin is that I think you will genuinely be a happier and a better programmer for it. This is what I often call Kotlin's best feature. It's not really about any single feature. A lot of times people ask me, like, what's your favorite thing about Kotlin? And I've always had trouble answering that because I never thought of it about any particular one thing being like the thing that makes me really enjoy using it. It's sort of the sum of its parts and the whole thing, then how it all works together, that really draws me to it and really makes it enjoyable. And putting all those pieces together when you use those really makes your work better and a lot easier. This is a quote from my boss, David Heinemeier Hansen, also known as DHH. He wrote this quote many, many years ago about Ruby. But as I read it and I began to relate to it from a Kotlin perspective, it very much holds. So he said, would you truly be happy working in this environment 8 hours a day? This is especially important for choosing a programming language. Happiness has a cascading effect. Happy programmers do the right thing. They write simple, readable code. They take clean, expressive, readable, elegant approaches. They have fun. And he goes on for a little bit more. So it's really interesting to think about what a big difference sort of just a programming language can make if you're coming from the Java side and thinking, like, well, what's the big deal? And especially that cycle, that cascading effect that you think about, it's really, really interesting. I definitely went through this myself, and I can attest to it that it's completely true, and I think a lot of people have. So what you find is that when you have a capable and friendly language, it is genuinely easier and more fulfilling to do your work, right? The more fulfilling your work is, generally speaking, the happier you're going to be, right? The happier you are, you're going to tend to make better choices, right? You're not going to cut corners. You're not going to just copy paste stuff from Stack Overflow. You're not going to get frustrated by the language holding you back. You're going to be making better choices as a result. As you keep making better choices over and over and over, repetition, you're going to build better habits, and then ultimately, yes, you will become a better programmer. I can say without BSing you, like, I am definitely a better programmer today, 3.5 years later, than I was without Kotlin. So I think it sounds like a lot to take in, but I do think that Kotlin can make a huge, huge difference in your performance and your happiness. If you're coming over from the Java side, a second thing to keep in mind is that I think you'll see tremendous time savings. This one's a bit difficult to prove. It's very anecdotal, but I think you'll hear a common thread from people who have come over from the Java side, which is that, you know, people on average probably are saving something like 10 to 15%. Maybe more, maybe less. Again, it's difficult to quantify. But there's good reason for that, and there's good reason for those stories. The biggest thing is sort of obvious. There's just plain and simply less code. Like, there is just less surface area, right? So physically, you're going to be going over less code, right? There's going to be less boilerplate, there's going to be less ceremony. Literally everything you do in Kotlin compared to Java is going to be faster and easier, right? And so I'm talking about maintaining code, like just coming back to something, understanding what it did 2 years later, right? That's going to be easier. Your new code is obviously going to be quicker because it's just going to be a little bit shorter. And your code reviews and your pull requests are going to be quicker too, right? Everybody who's reviewing your code is going to be able to do it a little bit faster as well. So there's just a general time savings you're going to see when you're using Kotlin over Java. And hopefully you're just going to write fewer bugs too, right? Obviously you can still write shitty code in Kotlin. It doesn't prevent you from doing that. But again, just the very fact that there's less surface area means you have a less chance of writing something you didn't intend to. The language actually gives you a fighting chance to be a better programmer. The third and final reason I think you should really consider it, if you haven't already, is that Kotlin has a really bright future. And it's kind of easy to get behind something that's got a future, right? You don't need to worry about whether it's going to be here in 3 or 5 years. A few years ago, we weren't in that same boat. We were kind of like, I'm not sure, but it's for sure going to be around. And I don't even mean this from the sense of like, you've probably heard about Kotlin's Stack Overflow rankings and its adoption numbers and all this other stuff from like a PR perspective. That's really nice. And that's all good stuff. But that's not really what I would consider most important into determining whether or not it has a bright future. What makes Kotlin's future really bright is the philosophy behind it and the fundamentals and the pillars on which it stands. So last year at KotlinConf, Andrei Brazlev, the lead language designer for Kotlin, talked about this a bit. He talked about these 4 pillars. And the biggest thing was that overall, Kotlin is built to be a pragmatic language, right? It is not an academic language, right? JetBrains built Kotlin for themselves, for their apps, and for their products, right? This is a language that is built for you. It's built to solve problems that you have gone through or that you're going to go through, right? This is not a language that Andre and the rest of his team have built for a marketing team or a product manager or for academia or anything like that. They have taken serious strides to making this a pragmatic language for you to use not just today, but many years going forward. And the 4 pillars they talk about are really important. I think even if you just look at these, you can say, I see like these people understand what I want, right? These are the 4 pillars: readability, reuse, interoperability, and safety and tooling, right? So making sure all of your code is readable, not just short. Focusing on reuse, right? Just writing less code, letting the standard lib and other elements of the language do more work for you. Interoperability, again, being able to use Java and connect with Java and not have to worry about that means it's going to be around for a while. And then safety and tooling, right? Like JetBrains is king of making really great software and IDEs to help you, and the language is built on a very safe type system with all the nullability stuff that's built in. And the one thing that most people don't talk about, or a lot of people don't talk about, is that like Kotlin or JetBrains is really slow and steady with these releases. Like, and I don't even mean slow in like a bad way. I mean slow like in the best possible way, right? It took them something like 6 years to get to 1.0. They were in like 0.9 beta or whatever for many, many years. And even today, 1.3.5 came out yesterday, I think. So, you can see that the progression that they take it very seriously. Like, they don't make big breaking changes. They're very safe with experimental features. And so again, as a programmer, you can appreciate sort of the pace at which they build out. Okay, so now you're past the toddler phase. Hopefully I've convinced you that it's for you and you've grown up to be sort of like a full-fledged kid. You can walk, you can talk, you can sort of make some choices for yourself, and you're probably in school, right? And you're learning a lot of things and you're growing up. But in most ways, or in a lot of senses, like, you still don't really know what you're doing, right? You're learning a lot, but you still need guidance, and you need a lot of help from your parents, your teachers, a lot of other people that are there to help you. And so, just like any kid, if you've met any kids, they got a lot of questions. And even though you might be feeling good about the choice and be like, okay, I'm going to use Kotlin, I know it's for me, I can logically assume it's for me, you might be feeling good about that part, but you might also be on edge a little bit because you're running into this like unknown minefield of like, well, that's cool that I'm going to use it, but where do I start? And like, how do I learn the language? Like, how do I keep learning the language and shipping work at the same time? Like, that's a tall order if you're like working on a product or you're working on projects and you're learning a new language as you go along, right? So hopefully, as a good parent or teacher, I hopefully have a few answers for you, not all of them, and I can provide just a little guidance for you to help get through this stage. So these are mostly very practical tactics that I think you should kind of keep in mind if you're just getting started off. The first thing I would say is, like, if you're just kind of learning the language, start with small conversions. Don't write something brand new. It's way too much to deal with, right? Think of it as like stretching or warming up. Like, you wouldn't just go run out your door and just go run a marathon probably, I'm assuming, right? You would probably stretch, figure out how long you can go and stuff like that. And the thing with small conversions that's really, really nice, taking an existing piece of code, is that it lets you verify known behavior before you start breaking a bunch of stuff, right? So you probably have tests to back up a lot of the stuff that you're going to be changing. You can change those, run the tests, and you're good to go. The other good thing is that if you do them in small bits, you can do them over and over to practice, right? If you change a method here, right? You can start to understand what little changes can do to make a big difference in your code. So when I say small conversions, your next logical question might be like, what should I do? Like, what should I convert? And a lot of people will suggest that you take on tests. Like, tests are a good place to start. I don't really buy that. I say no tests. I say you should do something real. For me personally, like, tests have never felt like a real part of the app, and they're kind of boring. Tests are great. Like, I use them, obviously. I write them. I'm never, like, super thrilled to write them. They're great. The problem with converting a test as your first thing that you do in Kotlin is that it's not going to really expose you to the interesting parts of the language, right? The interesting parts of the language are going to be in your real code, when you have to write all sorts of complicated business logic with Kotlin. When you're writing a test and you write like 2 lines and an assertion, like, it's not going to give you a real good sense of what the language can do. The other thing is that you're not going to be super excited about it either. My guess is if you convert a test, you'd be like, well, that's cool, a test ran, my test suite is green. That's not that exciting. And for me, and I think for a lot of people, getting excited is actually really, really important. Like, when you see something converted over to Kotlin and you see it works exactly the same in like 30% lines and a much easier read in a much easier to read way, like, that's going to get you excited. The first significant thing that I converted was an adapter in Android, a list adapter. And I remember I cut, like, seriously, probably 30% of the lines. I had a much more readable, stack of code. And I was, like, seriously thrilled. Like, I wanted to go do more and more and more and more. And that's a natural thing to happen. If you do something that's kind of not really real and you don't see it running, you may kind of get a little bored of it. So my advice is to take something real instead of a test. So if it's not a test, what would I recommend? Well, there's a bunch of things that you could do. It kind of depends where you're coming from, if you're doing Android or server-side. Every app usually has some semblance of these, so maybe you have a small model you can work with. Certainly you've got utility methods out there that you could convert either to extensions or just convert them. And then if you're an Android, adapters that are small are a good option as well. And just converting these will give you all sorts of senses of, like, what to do with the language. You can get used to nullability, which is not something you have in Java. You can get used to optional and default parameters. You can start using data classes instead of models, just like a straight POJO. You can kind of get used to flow control ideas. You can get used to what the standard lib has to offer you. Like, there's a bunch of stuff. Even if you convert just like 3 or 4 utility methods, there's a bunch of stuff that you're going to get exposed to. The second thing I would say is, as you're going through this stage, is you really got to get rid of any idea of, like, being really good at Kotlin, and legitimately just forget about the idea of trying to be perfect. One of the things you'll hear a lot in Kotlin when you come over is this phrase, idiomatic Kotlin. It is effectively just like the natural way of writing Kotlin, sort of the best practices, if you will. And it's mostly just to kind of keep you from taking your Java habits and applying them over to Kotlin. And these are great things to know, right? The idioms are very important, and you should choose to write this way if you can. The problem is, if you get hung up on them, you'll end up down these super deep rabbit holes, and you'll just, like, iterate over the same piece of code over and over and over. And that's no good for anybody either, right? I know this too because I used to do this quite a bit, so I'm telling you this from experience. I would write, just like a 10-line method, and I would just be iterating over that over and over and over, right? I'd be like, oh, this has something in the standard lib, and this, I can do this, and I can make this a higher order function. I should make this an extension. Like, all of a sudden, like, 3 hours goes by, and I just have, like, literally the same thing, and I'm like, it's no better than it was. And so you just keep going down these rabbit holes if you keep thinking, like, I'm going to make this perfect Kotlin, and you'll never get anything useful done. You'll stall out and you'll sort of get demotivated. It definitely happened to me at some point. So just like anything else you build, just get it working, get it good, and then maybe someday you can make it great. Third and finally, once you're just getting started out, is this: you just need to focus on a few key concepts that work for you, the ones that help sort of click in your brain. Kotlin is a really big thing. Obviously, it's a language, and even in the last 3.5 years, it's gotten even bigger. It can do even more now. And so it can be overwhelming to try to learn, like, what are all the things I should learn? There's, like, I mean, when I started 3.5 years ago, there were no coroutines. Like, KTOR wasn't a thing. Multi-platform wasn't a discussion. Like, none of that stuff existed 3.5 years ago, and now they do. So there's even more stuff that can overwhelm you. What I have found is that when you're first starting off, is that if you lock into just a couple things that make sense for your brain, that's really going to help out. And when I say for you, I really do mean that, right? Something is really going to click for somebody else on your team. It's not going to click for you, but something will really make sense for you. And if you start to imply those throughout your own code, they're going to start to make a big difference. Everything you'll see is, you'll start to sort of see patterns in how everything sort of works together. For me, there were 3 things that really helped. One was just using flow control stuff in the standard lib, just using how ifs and fors and loops are constructed in Kotlin. There's just some conveniences that just make it a little bit nicer and a little bit better. The collection stuff that's in Kotlin standard lib is really, really good. And just writing extension functions, like just being able to extend off an object and have it do whatever you want, and then having that code be so much more readable on that object that you extended. Those made a big difference for me. I focused in on those 3 when I started, and they made a huge difference in like the first 6 months that I was writing. All right, jumping to the next stage in your Kotlin life, which is the teenage years. So in this point of your life, you're probably moving pretty fast. Maybe you're a little insecure, maybe a little reckless, trying to prove yourself, trying to do some crazy stuff. As it relates to Kotlin, I think at this point, and obviously the time period depends, but it's maybe like a year, year and a half into it or something like that. You've been working for Kotlin for a while, and you're feeling pretty good, right? Things are starting to click. You're starting to get your groove. And at the same time, you're like really excitable, and you know just enough to be dangerous, right? Which is to say, like, it's actually really fun. Like, you can do a lot of stuff. You're like writing code like crazy. This is a really fun stage. And if you're anything like me, you might start to get a little emotional about it as well. This was the phase in which I sort of declared that I'm in love with Kotlin. Like, this is amazing. I love this language. I know that sounds weird and cheesy, but it's absolutely true. This was the phase in which I realized that Kotlin was making a significant, major difference in my work and my career, and as a result, my life, right? And those things that my boss, DHH, talked about, how much happier you can be when you have a programming language, when you're armed with the right programming language, how much better your work can be, how much more fulfilling your work can be. Like, I actually started to realize those things. And that made a big difference at this point in my journey. And so I started proclaiming to the world, like, oh, like, I love Kotlin. I started writing blog posts. I started doing talks about it. I started tweeting about it constantly. Like, I'm sure it was pretty annoying to everybody around me. But it isn't all roses either. And there's an important counterpoint into this, like, feeling of elation that happens in this stage as well, I would say. And that's that you're going to make a bunch of mistakes in this phase. Like I said, you know just enough to be dangerous, and you're really excitable. The thing is, like, at this point, you're not necessarily armed with the right experience to make all the right choices, which is pretty much what being a teenager is all about. It's very common in this phase to over-engineer stuff, to try to use all the parts of the language, to go really deep and apply everything you possibly can in the language. It's super common in this phase. And it manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. But ultimately, this is probably not going to be the best Kotlin that you ever write in this phase. And you just kind of got to accept that. And really, the only thing I can say to help you during this stage is that it's going to be okay. Like, you just got to accept the fact that you are going to screw up. Things are not going to be perfect. You just kind of need to accept it and move on. You're going to make some really small mistakes that aren't going to be a big deal, and you're going to make some huge, major mistakes with the language as well. Again, I know this from experience. And it's okay, right? Just like the teenage years, like, everybody's gone through it. Everybody gets through it. It's fine. You just got to be able to realize that and get through it. So try to keep your head up, move forward. Some specific things you can do. First, like, just take a breath and slow down, right? This is a good time to check yourself and what you're thinking a little bit more often than you did maybe, a month or two before, right? One question you should ask yourself a lot is like, okay, I see that the language lets me do this. I know I can do this. Like, should I do this? Like, should I write an extension function for this? Like, should this be a higher order function? It's really easy to abuse those things that are just waiting there for you to use them. My personal problems, I played a lot of code golf, right? I wrote everything to be excessively concise, which really hurt the readability, but I was like, whoa, look how short everything can be. Everything can be on one line if you want to. I wrote a ton of extension functions. And then I realized, like, they were being used in literally one other class. It was being called from one other place. And I made higher order functions for like everything. Like, I was making all sorts of mistakes. Not like major, but enough that was not great. And so again, with the benefit of hindsight, this is a good time to try to slow down. One thing you can do, I think that would really help, is that you can kind of revisit the stuff that you do know and go a little bit deeper and just kind of revisit the fundamentals. One thing that I did that I actually found that was really helpful was just going back and reading a book that you had read before. So I had read Kotlin in Action sort of when I started, and then I worked on Kotlin for a year or so. And then I went back and reread Kotlin in Action, and I was like, whoa, all this stuff is the same, but it's completely different, right? It's the exact same content, but everything that I read through again, like, I understood it a little bit better. I saw a slightly different angle on how I could use it, right? So going back and sort of going over the stuff that you already know is a really good idea at this time. Also, if there's a conference talk that you've been sort of waiting to get to that you haven't been able to, again, another good thing to sort of dig into at this point. And specifically, I would say, go dig deep into the stdlib. This is one of my favorite parts of the Kotlin language. It's sort of the gift that just keeps on giving. They keep adding to it. It keeps doing more stuff. Every day I like look into doing something that it has a function to do it. It's a huge, tremendous benefit to using Kotlin, and discoverability is probably one of its weaknesses. Like, it's hard to tell, like, what does a language have that it can do for me? So the more you dig into it, sort of the better you'll get at it. Okay, so we blew through the teenage years, and like finally we've reached adulthood, right? And this is where I'm at, right? So this is where I think I have it mostly figured out, at least as much as humanly possible. I've gone through all the awkward phases, I can make my own rules, and I'm generally making pretty good decisions. So things are pretty comfortable, right? Day to day, things are uneventful, they're unfussy, maybe a little boring, but this is a good thing. This is a period of calm productivity, right? This is one of my favorite times that I've ever had with a programming language, right? You can pretty much build what you want. You know how to do everything that you need to do. You don't feel like, you're still learning stuff, but you don't feel like the pressure to be like, I have to learn everything. Like, this is just like this nice period of time to just enjoy, where you're like, all right, I'm pretty decent at Kotlin. Like, I can do what I need to do. This is also the time where I think that you start to build a real genuine appreciation for those 4 pillars of Kotlin, right? You sort of begin to appreciate like what Andre was talking about in terms of readability, reusability, tooling, interoperability. All those things sort of start to become more concrete, and you start to appreciate them a lot. Having said that, your brain might be like, hey, what's next? Like, this is me. When I get sort of comfortable, I'm like, get a little antsy, and I start thinking about like, what's the new stuff I can start playing with? What's the new hot tech I can pick up? Only thing I would say about that is, before you start jumping into that stuff, first take a step back and just focus on your code clarity. One of the best things about Kotlin is how clearly you can express something, right? So look back at those mistakes that you made as a teenager, learn from them, compare them to what you're doing today. You don't need to fix them all, but just be aware of like, wow, look at the difference between what I used to do and what I do now, and just be aware of it and continue to move forward from there. From then, now it's time to embrace your curiosity, right? Once you've sort of like, okay, I'm going to focus on code clarity, you've had a chance to enjoy the peace and quiet for a bit, you start thinking about what's next, right? And you have sort of 2 paths you can pick here. You can either go for breadth or you can go for depth, right? Breadth being like trying to think about more places that you can use Kotlin, depth being more advanced on the stuff that you already know, right? For me, I've chosen breadth. I've decided to go a little bit wider, so I'm kind of poking around at Ktor. I'm going to be at Kotlin Conf this year talking about it. Ktor has piqued my interest. For a lot of people, it's been multi-platform, has been hot right now. Coroutines are obviously super, super important, but you can go really, really deep into coroutines if you really want to know. So there's a lot of different ways you can go. The biggest thing I would say here is, as you're deciding like what's going to be next for you, is to not follow the crowd. Just do something that you're genuinely interested in, not something that everybody else says is cool, right? You're at a good moment in your Kotlin journey. Like, don't just jump into something that everybody else is doing. The easiest thing to do is just jump on the bandwagon that everybody else is doing, give a talk on it, and be like, okay, that's fine. For me, like I said, I picked up Ktor. It is by no means like the hottest subject in Kotlin. Like, it's interesting to me because it's server-side stuff, right? I haven't written server-side Java in a long, long time. I'd like to be more balanced into writing apps, or client apps and server-side apps. So I'm going to go into Ktor stuff. But for sure, multi-platform, native, JS, those are hotter topics. I just chose not to go that way because it doesn't interest me. And I think that's important because, again, when we talk about getting excited about what you want to learn, what you want to invest your time in, it's important to do the things that are going to keep you motivated. Like, you have a reason to do it. And your reason can't be like, just because it's cool, everybody else is doing it. Okay, so that's where I have to stop because like I don't know what happens after that. That's where I'm at. Stages 5, 6, 7, whatever else happens after that, I have no idea. I'm hoping some people out there have actually gone past me, and you guys can tell me what happens after this because I have no idea. just remember again, this is just one possible journey. This is not going to be an exact path for anybody. Maybe you'll follow something similar. Maybe you'll have absolutely nothing in common with this at all. I hope, though, that by sharing it, you found some bits of it that have been relatable. Or if nothing else, the fact that I hopefully shared my story means that you'll share your story with other people as well. So I want you to use that. I hope you stay connected to the community. It's important to do events like this. It's important to go to local meetups, stay involved in the common Slack, and keep building those personal connections. Again, because like telling these stories really, really helps someone else. Even if you don't know it, you're probably helping somebody else. So with that, I'll say good luck on your journey. Thank you for listening.